Hi, my name is Taria Greenberg. I'm with the Capel Creatives of the Capel Arts Council, and I'm here today with Ted Storm, who is an artist who is featured in our latest exhibit in the Mr. Cooper Gallery at the Capel Art Center. This is an exhibit that was brought to us by the National Quilt Museum. And I'd like, Ted Storm, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm Ted Storm, and first of all, Ted is not my real name. My real
Okay,
name is Rietta, but that's
Rieta.
hard. That's hard for American people. And also a younger brother, he couldn't pronounce Rietta, so he said Teta, and that's how Ted appeared. I
Wow.
am, okay, I'm Dutch. I'm living in Schravenzande. It's a
Okay.
village, it's a village near the beach in Holland. So on
Wow.
the west coast of Holland, and well, I'm a quilter.
Well, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit before we talk about the quilt that you have in the exhibit. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about uh, how you started sewing and then how you started quilting.
Well, sewing has been my interest, more like playing with fabrics,
Uh-huh.
not sewing for clothes. That was not done in
Right.
our family because
Oh,
someone else
okay.
was a seamstress, so we got the
Okay.
clothes. And but I was interested in fabrics, and I started when I was 17. I started an education, a study on textile art to
Mhm.
become a textile art teacher 4 years later. And so my interest in textiles is there, but never with sewing or a sewing machine involved. I can sew with a machine,
Uh-huh.
but it's not my favorite. So the study involved everything on lace making, crochet, everything you can dream of to decorate fabrics or to embroider. So worldwide, any techniques I was introduced to briefly, technical portion, and then you had to design a piece of yourself by yourself. And then the chapter was closed. So in 4 years, it was not only the textile education, but also 9 different um, drawing classes. So it was a very complex and complicated study, but at the end, it was great because still today I enjoy everything I learned. I was trained at that study.
Uh-huh.
So after 2 years of working as a student there, I was asked, would you please help us as a school? In our school, we have a teacher who is ill and can't teach anymore. Can you take over some of her hours? So barely a student for 2 years, I took over some of the hours, and that made me, by practice, that everything
Mhm.
I was taught at school, I could practice with my students who were just a couple of years younger than I was at that time. So after my study, I stayed there and I worked for 22 years in that kind of high school,
Okay.
and always working on with textiles as a hobby. I made huge wall hangings for centerpieces in rest homes. I had architects coming to me,
Uh-huh.
and so always wall hanging and being creative beside my job as a teacher at school. I had I needed a carpenter to mount my
Uh-huh.
huge pieces.
Uh-huh.
And it was until 86 that one of my suppliers came to me and she said, Ted, you should go to that patchwork exhibit.
Uh-huh.
Well, patchwork, I didn't care for at all. Why cut up pieces and sew together? I didn't like it. And I know how to do it. I had to do it because it was in the field
Uh-huh.
for my students, for my pupils. And but she told me twice, that's something for you. You should go there. And I thought, okay, I better go, because the third time she will ask, how was it? So I went there, and that's when I saw quilts for the first time in my life. And that immediately hit me, because I realized what I was creating was a top only. It was applique sewed together, but it was a top. It just needed a bedding and a backing. I don't
Uh-huh.
need a carpenter anymore. So, so from then on, I just jumped into the quilting world, and I was like a sponge. I needed to know all of these techniques, because patchwork was one of the subjects while I was a student, but quilting, never even the word. So it was just, there was nothing that I could refer to, hardly any shops, one shop at that time. So I bought one English book, and sort of a leaflet book. It was translated into Dutch. And with the book on my lap, I tried to do patchwork and quilting. I trained myself how to quilt. And from then on, it was a portion of my life. I needed to know that.
Right.
And so, wow, it's quite a story. Aren't you bored yet?
No, I'm riveted. Um,
So,
for me, it
so
was going to see the Women of Gee's Bend, like that moment where you see
yeah,
quilts and something in you is moved viscerally, and you just
yeah.
feel like you have to,
It's
create.
in you. It's in you.
Yes.
And I think that by itself already, it's the virus that hits you. I could say a good virus this time. And so from then I made one patchwork quilt, but I
Okay.
didn't care for the straight lines.
Mhm.
Math is not my favorite subject. So I made one quilt, trained myself how to do quilting stitches, and then went to one store in the Netherlands that time and said, I'd like to be more free form, more like what I used to do, is more elegant lines, etc. And that lady of the store, I think she never realizes how important she was at that time. She said, I asked for applique. So can you tell me how to do applique and those flowing lines? And then she said, applique is no quilt. Oh, okay, hush, because she was a lady. And so I never told her anything. Went home and had a subscription of Quilters Newsletter magazine at that time, where Baltimore quilts were listed. So I thought, I need to know that. It is possible. And then in 88, people from Houston traveled over the ocean, first time bringing their prize-winning quilts, antique quilts, to Austria in 88 in Salzburg. And left or right, I had to go there. So I told my husband, I need to be there.
Mhm.
I have a short time slot because I was still teaching at school.
Mhm.
We have an old camping van,
Uh-huh.
but if it's better if you join me. But if not, I'll go by myself. I hardly knew how to drive the thing, but whatever. I knew I had to be there.
Uh-huh.
So I was clear that I should be there in time and signed up for classes, etc., etc. Everything new, competition. We had nothing like that. We have never been exposed to beautiful quilts
Right.
at that time. And so at the end, he said, okay, I will hook up my racing bike, because sitting and waiting
Uh-huh.
for you is nothing. I will do my bike riding. he hooked up his racing bike, and I found out later why he was not keen on traveling to Salzburg. There was a world championship in soccer that time,
Oh,
and
so he was excited.
he is a soccer fan.
Uh-huh.
So it ended. Well, I was in the Congress Center with all my fellow quilters. He
Mhm.
sat on a chair in the mid of a shopping area for an open window. He could see television. That so it was hilarious, but it was there that I met an elderly lady sitting in the audience, and that lady is Lois. Was she passed away, was Lois Ide, and I was there with a mission. My mission was ask how to do applique. How can I do applique? So I met her once, and she was passing out little pieces of fabric
Uh-huh.
to share and
Yeah.
exchange. So
Yes.
I said, can I have one? And she said, well, what country are you? I said, Holland. Oh, she said, I don't have Holland yet. So I said, well, I promise you, as soon as I'm home, I will send Dutch fabric to your address. And I have the little bit of fabric here.
Oh.
And this is it with her name tag on it. This is the piece of fabric she gave me.
Yes.
And so I definitely must have asked about how to do applique. And a few months, and we started, so I sent her my fabric and we started writing back and forth. And she invited me, why don't you come over to my house? I can show you so much. I can give you every answer of your question. And well, she invited me several times by letter, but at that time, I'd never been in a plane before.
Oh, wow.
I'd never been on vacation by myself. I had a son at home and a husband working. I had my job. So I just put the letter away to sit somewhere and, and but she became more strict and she said, what's your diet? And I've been a nurse and my husband is a physician, etc. So all of a sudden I thought, but it's very expensive. Can we afford that? And so at the end, I asked my husband, I said, well, Jaap, this lady is asking me to come over for quilting, but, and then he said, well, just take a credit card and go. And I thought, oh, crap. And I've been, so careful about this. Just go. So indeed, we had a credit card and I booked a plane, was in the plane for the first time of my life and went to her. And I spent my Easter holiday there in her house, in her basement with her friends. It was heaven. It was 10 days of heaven.
Oh,
and
what kind of things did you learn? What kind of things did they show you and teach you?
Everything I asked for was how to do a binding, how to do applique, how to do ruching. And she set up several card tables, invited friends of hers, and set me at a card table opposite of a friend of hers. And that friend shared one of the techniques I was introduced to. And then when I said, okay, I made pictures, took notes. And then I said, I understand. I know what's going on. Next table.
Oh my gosh, that sounds like heaven.
It was, and it ended up with a file. I think it was a pile of paper that thick. So when I went up to the States, I was completely in the European version of Amish, American stuff. Everything is there. But by the time I got back, I was loaded with all these techniques she learned by her mother. So she passed it on to me because she had no one in the family, direct family, to share. So she passed it on to me. But by the time I was in the plane back home, I thought, how on earth can I thank an American lady? I cannot create an Amish style quilt. No way, no Baltimore. It must be something that reflects Holland. So the moment I was home again, I went over to Delft, and Delft is where they have blue Delft ware. And I made a small tile version, and so I went over and I said, can I be inspired by one of your patterns? And sure, go ahead. You're crazy, because why work for so many hours when you can paint it in 10 minutes? But they were fine, and I tested and tried all her techniques, and Lois came over to me to another quilt expo, etc. So we saw each other more instruction added. And when we were in 90, we were in Odense in Denmark, and another quilt expo was there. And then we heard that the next quilt expo 2 years later would be in Den Haag. That's close to where I live, The Hague. And the theme was discovering a new world. And I thought, that's my theme. So I started working on a quilt based on a plate my brother inherited by my grandma. I was not interested in Delftware at all. Your grandma stuff, that's old-fashioned stuff, so no. But I used that plate as inspiration to make a quilt with all Lois's techniques in it. And she said, if you're allowed to hang, it was my first competition. Actually, I'd made one patchwork quilt, 2 small ones to test techniques. And then I started on my Holland's Glory quilt, my blue one. And that was my, what you consider a 4th quilt. And I entered it in competition, and it was a finalist. And at the end, I had best overall workmanship and viewer's choice.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
And Lois was there. So, but I was such a young quilter. Hardly knew what's going on. And immediately I got invitations after that win from America. I thought, why would I go to America to teach things? They all know it, but it appeared they really didn't know. Many people were very, very interested. And so that also marks the end of my career at school, because I realized if I want to be able to teach all over the world, I can't be a teacher at school. Right. So I ended my job.
Well, I'd like to ask you some questions about your process. So you said the original quilt was inspired by Delftware. When you start a quilt, I'm curious about how you choose your fabrics, how you choose your colors. Do you plan it out ahead of time, or do you make it up as you go along? Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah. I like to be prepared, because the way how I applique, it's hardly impossible to take out stitches or regret a choice later. So I make a design that fits my table, not a too wide piece of paper, but a piece of paper that fits. And in scale, I set up the sections of width of border, centerpiece, if it's a medallion style of something different. So I set everything up in scale, and I make the contrasts. Color is not that important yet. Contrast is more important. What is your background and what is your design? So I have it in contrast. And once I like it, just by the lines itself, when I start liking it, I go over to a copy store and have it copied to the size I want it. So if I want to have it copied 80 by 80 inches, that's what they do.
Okay.
And then I have the design on my wall, but also smaller stages. You can never copy from your table in one session for 80, for instance, 80 by 80. You have to trace 3 or 4 times in between. Otherwise, your lines are half an inch thick. So if you have a thin line fit on a table paper, piece of paper on your table, you need to enlarge it, for instance, twice, trace it again with a very fine pen, trace it again, enlarge it, trace it again, etc., to end with a 80, for instance, 80 or more size quilt with thin lines. Otherwise, you can't use it. So the stage of prep work, just by drawing and enlarging, and I found anytime you do your tracing, you create more your own personal lines in the quilt, in the design. And so after that is done, and I have several stages, it's also possible to add pieces of fabric, just little dots and pieces of fabric. So I have an impression where I would like the light colored ones, the darker ones. And that's how I set it up. So a yellow means yellow, but it doesn't mean the same fabric of yellow. I like to use different fabrics in value near the original idea.
Mhm.
So that's how I take off. And while tracing and working, I already focus on the sequence of work. And I like to create everything, if possible, away from the background, combine flowers and stuff in my hand. So I have a load of separate articles that at the end I will put together onto my background.
I see.
So that's
and when you, what kind of, you use totally just cotton, or do you use other kinds of media? Or
yeah, I have to laugh because I'll tell you, I use cotton and I prefer the quilting cottons. I do use silk and I do use shiny stuff, lame or whatever it's called. I don't know the word in English, but it's a bit glitzy stuff. And so that's what I sometimes do. And for the elated quilt that's in your exhibit, I on purpose choose a fabric I absolutely disliked. And that was the plaid. I don't like plaids. I don't like browns.
Okay.
So, you know, because I wasn't only quilting, I was sort of a quilting school. I was teaching a lot of quilting classes over the years, and working on a quilt was like I only know the word in German. Sorry. To relax. I worked on a quilt. So it was while I was busy preparing my classes and teaching all over, it was at home that I could sit and relax and stitch. So while I was teaching color classes, I always say color is important, but not that important. Contrast is. So I thought, why not challenge myself with the most ugliest fabric I can find, and from there start on a quilt. And so the brown plaid in that quilt is my ugly start.
Well, I actually want to ask you a little bit about, you mentioned that that quilt was, your way to relax. I was
Yeah.
wondering for you, how much of quilting is about, creating a product versus the process of creating it? What do you, in terms of what you get out of it?
Mm,
Is it the act of making it that you enjoy, or is it the act of having a final piece? Or both?
well, it's the complete road to the end. It's the
Mhm.
complete road. Every portion of the road is a challenge.
Okay.
Nothing. I sometimes think that it's about 80% of the time I'm thinking, and I'm not production oriented. I can work for years on one quilt without
Mhm.
any problem. I'm not bored because I know I have this picture in my head. I know someday it will be done and it will be beautiful. And I know, and it's a challenge, and it's sometimes a bumpy road, but I have one law. I prepare well, I
Mhm.
test everything. So once it's in my quilt, I won't take it out.
Okay.
So so every time I work on elements, I know they are well done. I don't need to throw them out or exchange or anything else. I just use them. So
And how many hours do you feel like you would put into, say, elated? How many hours of hand sewing did
I
that?
tell you what,
You
I
have
took a
it written
note.
down.
I took out my notes because while working on a quilt, I never did that with my first quilt. I never
Mhm.
traced my hours. And the question came, how many hours? I
Yeah.
thought, okay, I have a stopwatch. So in total for Elated, it's 3, and I have a stop, and I'm strict with the stopwatch.
I'm
With
sure
if
you
the
are.
telephone is there, if I'm just don't work, I stop the stopwatch. So actual stitching hours, 3,053 hours and 51 minutes to complete Elated.
Wow.
And constructing, I don't know, but quilting. This,
Yeah.
so the moment I first started quilting, it's 1,221 hours and 14 minutes.
Wow. So the first number is doing the quilt
Total.
top, but then the actual quilting. So for people who are watching this and don't know, you make a quilt top and then you put batting in between and a backing, and the
And,
act of putting
and
those two
then
together
the
is
quilting
quilting.
starts. Yeah.
Yes. So that's over 4,000 hours. That's a lot for
No, no,
one.
no. In total, you detract that. I
Oh, I'm
have a
sorry.
total. So over 3,000
Uh-huh.
includes the quilt.
The 1,000 of quilting. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. That's a lot.
Besides
So,
my job as a quilting teacher.
right, right. Um, and it explains why it's so gorgeous. And when I looked at it and just saw all the handwork, and oh my gosh, it just inspired me so much. I couldn't wait to get home. And yes. I wanted to ask a little bit about, when you make a quilt, are you making it as a piece to hang on a wall, or does it also have a utilitarian value? Like, do you also think of it as something that keeps you warm, or is it more as a piece of art that doesn't have a use? Not a
Well,
use, but you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
it's a piece of
but
art as
you,
opposed to
yeah.
something you put on a.
Well, well, the way that Elated is made, and my previous quilts and the one hanging beside me, these are just made for fun. I like to make a quilt, and I live in a small row house in a row, 6 or 8 houses together in Holland. Small. No way can I hang a quilt that size. That's my design wall.
Right.
So so I will never be able to hang quilts like most of you in America can do, nor we are not used to sleep under quilts. We
Okay.
have our feather beds.
Right.
So I have made one quilt to be used. And so if I'm sitting on the couch and I cuddle up, I have that quilt. But all my other quilts, I have been sleeping under at least once, because I firmly believe a quilt is not a quilt until one have slept under it.
I love that.
So yes.
And when you see a quilt hanging in a museum, how do you, or an exhibit, how does that change how you view the quilt versus, seeing it in your studio and then it's up, for display? How does that change how you interpret it? And how do you think for viewers, for who are appreciating it, how do you think that changes the way they see it?
You think about my quilt?
Yes,
Personally?
your quilt. How when it's up display like that, as opposed to like when you're going through the process of making it, how does your interpretation of it change?
Well, in one way, it's like a child that can walk and you have to let it go.
Hmm.
And I also realize that the way how I work is very specific.
Mhm.
And it's not fair if I would keep it at home and not to share, because that's the thing why my life as a quilter is still on. It's the sharing and it's the relation between people admiring quilts.
Mhm.
They don't need to say, that's what sometimes I'm a bit sorry for the quilters, because when they see that type of quilt I make and they say, I can't do it. And I say, well, you don't need to. If you enjoy it, please enjoy it. If you go to the museum and see Rembrandt, you don't say, I can't do it. But
Right.
if you see a quilt, then I can't do it. So enjoy what you see and be inspired by portions
Hmm.
and try to see what the quilt really is, because sometimes you miss composition, you miss color choices, you miss techniques, and that a quilt is more than just fabric.
And what do you want us to notice about Elated? If someone goes into the Capella Art Center, into the Mr. Cooper Gallery and sees the exhibit, what do you want them to notice about it?
Well, I think the composition itself, it looks like a symmetrical composition. It has a plus and it has the diagonals. So if you point that plus and diagonals, you have 8 different triangles.
Okay.
And if you focus on the content of each of those 8 triangles, none of them is the same. And overall, you don't see it.
Oh, fascinating.
So I bet if
yeah.
you look again,
Okay,
you
I
will
will.
see it
I'm going
different.
back on Saturday, so I
You will
can't
see it
wait.
different. So
Okay.
I think that's, so it has nothing to do with techniques but just looking at it, the way you can see it. Okay, it's a symmetrical quilt, it's yellow here and there and that fabric and that's it. But no, just get into the 8 different triangles.
Okay. I also wanted to ask you, a lot of quilters, you talk about the earlier tradition of quilting, and I know in America there's definitely like the quilting bee and we're sewing together.
Yes.
And I'm wondering how you feel about how that has changed and, about the sort of lost community that was around quilting. And do you think that's something that could come back, or do you feel like that, is that something that quilters can still do?
Well, quilters definitely like to meet each other, but I think internet, Facebook, the groups, you have worldwide groups with one subject bonding together, but still the feeling, I think it's more from a distance rather than being close together.
Right.
I have never been able to, we have a group of quilters, but we don't work together. We don't stitch together like they did in the USA. We have no history of that. That's more America, not Europe. In Europe, it's your quilt, so you work on it and you need to have all the knowledge from beginning to end a good quilt.
Mhm.
But in America, it's more sharing and it's used. So when you have a certain age or when you go to college, there are reasons you may receive a quilt. That's something I miss here. In that way, my heart is, I'm Lois lived in Ohio, and I am more Ohio, the heart of it all principle with me.
My dad's actually from Ohio, so
Okay, so yeah.
but yes, so I understand that. And can I ask you some slightly nerd questions, like nitty gritty, like quilting questions? Like
Sure.
what, so when you hand stitch, what kind of thimble do you use? What kind of needles do you use? Cotton, thread, like kind of, what? You use a spoon? I can't wait to hear this.
Well, the thing is, it's the setting now. I have a small room, and
Okay.
that's the biggest bedroom. It's about 10 by 12 feet.
Okay.
Imagine there's a quilt frame there, over there, but it's too hard to handle. So I have made this setting for you, but I can show how I look as a quilter, and I can explain a little bit about it. Well, first, I have a thimble, and that is, wait, that's a Roxanne thimble. It has an open end,
I see.
but I'm always a bit different. I like to wear it like this.
Okay.
So on the sideways, because if you quilt, this extension of the thimble is right onto the surface of my quilt.
Mhm.
And if I have it normal, it's just perpendicular. So I turn it a little.
Okay.
Weird, I know.
No, this is help. I decided during the pandemic that I was going to learn applique. Like I was going to come out of the other side of this pandemic with a new skill set. So I'm just fumbling about. It's not anything.
Yeah, well,
so I'd love to hear anything you have to say about it.
Well, the only thing is, it's hard for me to show, but I'm a teacher, so I know the steps. So but there are so many ways to quilt. It's not my way.
That is true.
So I don't judge anything that looks like a quilting stitch is fine, except that I am a fine hand worker. So quilting is not just done with your middle finger.
Right.
Because if you sit on a frame, how can you turn a corner?
Mm-hmm.
So then I have my thumb thimble, and that is like a ring. It's open at the nail. It has can you see that? It has a cup in there. And because it's open, you can bend it so it fits your thumb, and it sits there, not on the tip, but it sits near the joint. So if every action, every line of stitches towards your body, you can do with your middle finger, and you can do that, okay? But away from your body, imagine a zigzag. You can't move under and over your quilt frame or turn. So then I use my thumb thimble to quilt away, and I can quilt with my thumb every line away from my body.
Okay.
And I think someday I will make a YouTube film with that.
You should. I would definitely watch it.
And then, well, so normally I have a starting position. Then I have, starting position. It's when you work towards your body, it's an arc movement. And then you make the arc movement deeper, but you always have to have a finger or contact with the tip of the needle in between, or underneath. So it's your starting position, your arc movement, further down, and then with the tip of your thumb, you're press the finger, you hold the
Mhm.
finger underneath, and then you push your needle. Many
Got it.
people do not analyze, they create their stitch and they come up with a too big stitch. But that means while they make the arc movement, they already push.
I
And you
see.
can do your arc movement and all your positions without a thimble, and not until you hold your ridge,
Mhm.
then
Got
you
it.
push.
And how do you
So,
keep your line so straight? Do you map it out ahead of time or you're eyeing it?
oh, I mark. If I don't mark, it gets closer and closer.
Oh,
So I
okay.
need to mark, yes. And well, a finger underneath, I protect it with a spoon.
Oh, okay. I
I
was
just,
wondering where the spoon came in.
I just, I am out of my fingers in 2 or 3 hours.
Oh,
So
okay.
if I have a spoon to catch the needle, I'm
Nice.
fine. And I have this gadget, and that's my needle puller. So if I have a line of stitches, I hop it onto my needle puller and then press something, and
Oh,
that holds the needle and saves your finger from this crooky problem. It's good for arthritis fingers.
that's helpful. Thank you. And then what kind of and then oh, that's fabulous. I appreciate that so much. And then I know some of the sewing ladies are going to ask what kind of thread you use. Is there a thread that you
Mm,
like?
What it's up to
Whatever's
you.
available. Yes.
Yeah, I think important is test first, because if you
Okay.
have dark fabrics and you have a certain choice of bedding, etc., when you pull up fibers, that's irritating. And it may
Yes.
be the thread, it may be the size of your needle, but if you
Mhm.
just do it in your hand, pot holder size, some lines to test with that particular brands of thread. If you quilt for quilts to use, you don't need to quilt in densely. And then I would go to use a cotton. I prefer cottons. I
Okay.
would use a cotton quilting thread, whatever brand, what you like. And if you quilt closer together, you
Mhm.
can go to a much lighter thread. So I even quilt with applique threads.
Okay.
And that's in the quilt you have in your exhibit. I
Yes.
quilted that with a size 50 applique thread.
Oh, wow. Um,
So,
what else would you like people who come? So I think a lot of people who will come to this exhibit may not have been to a quilt exhibit before.
ooh,
What else do you want them to know about just quilts in general? About, as a quilter, talking to people who may not have ever been to a quilt exhibit, what would you want them to think about and to know while they're there?
I think thinking about America, it's good to know that you don't need to create something perfect. You you must no, you don't. It's not much. If you enjoy what you're doing, I think that's important, and not the quilt police that says it should be this, it should be that, or that's not nice. No, when you can live with it and you enjoy it, it's fine.
And how do you know when a quilt is done? Like, I know you said at the beginning that you plan it all out ahead of time.
Yeah.
Is it done according to your original plan, or does it sort of speak to you and say, you know what, we've reached, I mean, do you ever
No,
edit as you go or
no.
does it,
I know. I even know the binding. I even know
you got
from
it all mapped out?
oh yes, and all fabrics are there. And maybe I change a little bit in not a color family, but a different fabric that relates to that family.
Mhm.
But everything, I don't like to have a surprise at the end. Oh, now I miss a little piece of that. Hey, who has a little bit? Because these fabrics are not always there forever.
Uh-huh.
So I know that it takes years for me to finish a quilt. So I'd rather be prepared and have
Uh-huh.
and maybe too many fabrics, but that's always way better than being short.
Right. And then running out and trying to scramble
Yep.
to,
Yeah,
yeah.
be prepared. I've been a Girl Scout. Be prepared.
I actually wanted to ask you one other thing. When you choose fabrics, do you just use solids or do you use fabrics with patterns in them? Or I guess you said you use plaid in this fabric, but generally speaking,
because
do you,
yeah, well, depends on the type of quilt. Like for Elated, I knew there were small elements, so no way would I use a big design
Mhm.
because I pick out the small elements. So then they tend to be subtle, maybe a bit design in it, but plaids are not my favorite. I have dark blue plaid there that reads as a blue.
Mhm.
So a little bit of pattern, but not a lot, because when it's small, it doesn't show.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, I I want to thank you so much. I learned a lot and it was just also so inspiring to meet you after admiring your quilt.
well,
So I want to thank
I
you
think
for your
it's an
time.
honor. It's an honor to be selected by the AQS to be part of the exhibit, because not everyone can visit the museum in Paducah, and now they bring quilts over to an other area in America where people are exposed to quilts. And I think your art center, I put Google on it, and I saw how beautiful it was.
Thank
And
you. It just opened.
I'm very pleased to be selected and be part of this, for
Oh,
sure.
thank you. This was as we were trying to decide, as we're building the art center and as we were thinking about as Capel Creatives, trying to think about what exhibits we wanted to have, I just so desperately more than anything wanted a quilt exhibit. So
Yeah,
this is the manifestation of a dream for me. So I'm
great.
just so, and it's so nice to meet you.
No,
So thank you
it
very
was
much.
wonderful.